Imagine a man sentenced to be burned alive at the stake. His wealth is seized, his name is dragged through the mud of Florence, and his children are condemned to exile alongside him. In the year 1302, Dante Alighieri did not just lose his home, he lost the very ground beneath his identity, and yet, instead of disappearing into the silence of history, he did something far more dangerous. He built hell. What you are about to see is not a dusty religious poem or a medieval lecture. It is a map of the human psyche drawn by a man who had to lose the world to find the universe. There is a moment that almost every human being reaches, whether they admit it or not. A moment when the structure of life that once felt solid begins to loosen, and the direction that once felt certain dissolves into something shadowed. It is in that moment that Dante asks the question that is older than nations and empires. How did I get here? And why does this dark wood feel so much like memory today on his... We walk the path of the outcast to decode the architecture of eternity. The gate is open and the descent begins now. Before there was a vision of heaven, there was a sentence of death. In the year 1300, a man stands on the outskirts of Florence and realizes he can never go home again. If he crosses the city gates, he will be burned at the stake. His reputation is in ruins, his wealth is confiscated, and the ground beneath his identity has turned to ash. Dante Alighieri is not a hero in this moment. He is a failure. A political refugee eating the salty bread of strangers and climbing the stairs of palaces that are not his own. But it is exactly in this state of total severance that the wood begins to grow around him. He realizes that the straight way of his life, the path of power and citizenship, is gone forever, and it is here, in the cold silence of exile, that he asks the question that will change human history. How does a soul find its way back when every map has been destroyed? What you are about to see is not just a poem. It is a map of the human psyche drawn by a man who had to lose the world to find the universe. We see him walking through the dust of a road in Verona, his cloak worn, his eyes fixed on a horizon that offers no comfort. The wind carries the smell of wood smoke and the distant ringing of bells from a city that has rejected him. And it is in this sensory isolation that the first lines of the comedy are born, not as literature, but as survival. Imagine waking up in a place where the sun no longer follows the laws of logic. Dante is 35 years old, the midpoint of the biblical span, and he finds himself within a dark wood so bitter that death is hardly more painful. This wood is not made of trees and soil. It is a psychological landscape of absolute disorientation, where every path leads back to the same shadow. We must understand the weight of this moment, because it represents the universal human experience of the collapse of meaning. His career is gone, his friends have betrayed him, and his faith feels like an empty shell. He tries to climb a sun-drenched mountain, a desperate attempt to fix his life through sheer willpower and ego. But he is blocked by three beasts who represent the gravity of his own nature: the leopard of his lust, the lion of his pride, and the she-wolf of an endless, gnawing greed that no success can ever satisfy. The she-wolf is the most terrifying because she is lean with cravings and has made many people live in wretchedness. Dante is paralyzed, caught between a mountain he cannot climb and a wood he cannot escape. The air is thick with the damp smell of decay, and the silence is so heavy it rings in his ears. And it is in this moment of total surrender, when the last drop of hope has evaporated, that a voice emerges from the silence. A voice that has been quiet for 1,000 years. Out of the grey mist appears the shade of Virgil. The great Roman poet and the personification of human intellect at its highest reach. Dante does not see a savior, he sees a master. An architect of language who reminds him that the only way to the summit is through the heart of the abyss. Reason, Virgil tells him, can guide you through the consequences of your choices. It can map the geometry of your failures, but it cannot carry you into the light of the final vision. Dante must choose to follow this ghost into the mouth of the earth, and this is the first psychological reset of our journey. The realization that before we can be transformed, we must be willing to witness exactly how we are broken. We see the two figures standing on the threshold, the living man and the shadow. The vibrant red of Dante's robes contrasting with the pale, translucent grey of the Roman poet, they walk toward the gate where hope is abandoned. A massive structure of ancient stone that seems to pulse with the weight of eternity. As the heavy, sulphurous air of the pit touches Dante's face, he hesitates, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the steady hand of Virgil rests on his shoulder, a silent promise that the mind can endure what the heart fears. And the odyssey truly begins. The descent does not begin with fire. It begins with the sound of a billion sighs. Before they cross the river Acheron, Dante encounters the vast and restless crowd of the neutrals. These are the souls who in life refuse to choose, who avoided commitment, who never aligned themselves with good or evil, but lived only for their own safety and comfort. Dante's contempt for them is visceral and sharp. He describes them as being forgotten by both heaven and hell because they never had enough character to merit a judgment. They are condemned to chase a blank banner that moves without direction, stung endlessly by wasps and hornets, their blood and tears feeding the worms at their feet. This is a profound psychological observation, that the refusal to take a stand, the desire to remain neutral in the face of injustice, is a form of They are the people who watched their neighbors being exiled and remained silent, who saw the corruption of Florence and looked away to protect their own trade. Dante realizes that to be human is to be aligned with something larger than the self. And as he watches these nameless thousands, he feels a cold shudder of recognition, realizing how close he came to this vacancy during his years as a politician. He leaves them behind without a word because they are not worthy of history, and he moves toward the dark waters where the ferryman waits. At the edge of the river Acheron, the air is torn by the screams of the newly arrived dead, and out of the fog comes Corin, the demon with eyes like burning coals. Standing in an old boat that reeks of ancient mud and sorrow, he shouts at Dante, telling him to stay back because a living soul has no place in the kingdom of the dead. But Virgil speaks with the authority of the divine, telling him that this journey is willed where power can do what it proposes. And Corin falls silent, his white-bearded face twisted in a grimace of obedience. Dante watches the souls crowd the shore like autumn leaves falling from a tree, each one driven by a terrifying desire to cross into their own punishment. Because, in hell, the soul desires the very thing that destroyed it. Dante steps into the boat and feels the weight of his living body cause the wood to groan and sink lower in the water. A physical reminder that he is an intruder in this realm of weightless shadows. The journey across the black water is a sensory nightmare. The splashing of the oars, the distant wailing, the cold wind that smells of metal and ash. And the pressure of the experience is so great that Dante's mind fractures. He falls into a deep sleep. A psychological defense against the realization that he is now truly separated from the world of light. Exile is not merely relocation, it is a slow and daily severance. Dante spent 19 years eating the salty bread of strangers and climbing the stairs of palaces that were never his own. We see him walking through the dust of a road in Verona at twilight, hearing a dialect that is not his own and watching families enter homes he can no longer claim. The wind carries the smell of wood smoke and the distant ringing of bells from a city that has rejected him. And it is in this crushing sensory isolation that the first lines of the comedy are born, not as literature, but as survival. He realized that because he had no city on earth, he had to build a city of the mind that could contain the entire history of human choice. His fury was the fuel, his longing was the compass, and his broken life became the blueprint for a masterpiece that would outlast the very stones of Florence. Dante wakes to the sound of thunder and finds himself on the edge of the first circle. Limbo. Here there are no screams and no fire, only a profound and heavy sadness that hangs in the air like a fog. This is the home of the unbaptized and the virtuous pagans, people like Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, who lived noble lives but lacked the light of revelation. They live in a hemisphere of light, surrounded by a noble castle with 7 walls, representing the 7 liberal arts and the 7 virtues of the intellect. Dante sees the great poets of antiquity emerge to greet Virgil, and they welcome Dante into their circle, making him the 6th among the high intelligences of the world. This is a moment of intellectual pride for Dante, but it is tempered by the realization that these souls are in hell because they are stuck in the limits of human reason. They have no hope, and their eternity is a perpetual longing for a truth they can never reach. Dante realizes that the intellect is a magnificent castle, but without a windows to the infinite. It becomes a beautiful prison. He sees the sad, quiet faces of the heroes and philosophers, and he understands that the most refined form of suffering is the awareness of what you have missed. He leaves the circle of light and moves toward the narrow opening where the true descent begins, toward a place where the air is no longer still. At the entrance to the second circle stands Minos, the grotesque judge of the dead, his long tail wrapping around his body to indicate which circle each soul must ascend to. He is the embodiment of the cold, mechanical justice of the ego, snarling at Dante as he passes. They enter a place where the light is dead and the wind bellows like a sea in a storm. This is the realm of the lustful, those who surrendered their reason to their appetites. They are whirled through the air in an eternal hurricane, never allowed to touch the ground or find a moment of rest, representing the restless and chaotic nature of passion when it is not guided by an inner compass. Dante sees the famous lovers of history, Cleopatra, Helen, Achilles, and Tristram, all tossed like leaves in the gale, but his attention is caught by 2 souls who move together, Francesca and Paolo, and he calls out to them in the name of love. They drift toward him, and Francesca speaks, her voice filled with a sorrow so melodic that it masks the horror of her condition. She tells him how a book about Lancelot led them to their first kiss, and how that kiss led to their murder. Dante is so moved by her story, so caught in the web of her beautiful rhetoric, that he faints once again. He has not yet learned that pity for a soul that has rejected its own goodness is a form of spiritual danger. He wakes in the 3rd circle under a relentless rain of heavy, foul-smelling water and hail that turns the ground into a stinking mire. Here the gluttons lie submerged in the mud, guarded by Cerberus, the 3-headed dog with red eyes and a greasy black beard who flays the souls with his claws. This is the externalization of the internal state of gluttony. The life lived only for the consumption of the senses becomes a life of being consumed by the material. Dante meets Ciorco, a Florentine who provides a dark prophecy about the blood that will be spilled in their city. Dante asks him about his former friends, men he thought were noble, and Choco tells him they are even deeper in hell. This is a sharp psychological blow for Dante, realizing that the people he admired in the sunlight of Florence had secret rot in their souls that he could not see. He begins to understand that social status and political reputation mean nothing in the landscape of the spirit. He watches as Cerberus is quieted by Virgil throwing handfuls of mud into his 3 mouths, a symbol that the lower appetites are never satisfied by quality. Only by quantity they move through the stinking rain. Dante's boots sinking into the flesh-like mud of the souls, and he feels the heavy boge of his own earthly appetites as he realizes that the body he values is the very thing that can become his anchor in the abyss. The air of the 4th circle is heavy with the smell of old iron and sweat, and at its threshold they encounter the ancient demon of wealth, who speaks in a clucking, fractured language that even Virgil barely understands, representing how the obsession with money destroys the very structure of human communication. They descend into a vast arena where 2 massive crowds of souls are locked in an eternal and futile labor. The hoarders who refuse to spend, and the squanderers who spent without reason. Each side pushes enormous heavy weights with their chests, colliding in the center with a sound like grinding stone, and then shouting at each other, "Why do you hoard, and why do you squander?" This is the most mechanical of all the punishments we have seen so far. A perfect externalization of the psychological trap of materialism. Dante realizes that these souls have lost their individuality so completely that their faces are blurred and unrecognizable, their identity having been absorbed by the objects they once possessed. Virgil explains that fortune is a blind and revolving wheel, and that the wealth of the world is like a handful of sand that slips through the fingers of empires. Dante watches the endless back and forth movement and feels a profound sense of the pointlessness of earthly ambition when it is stripped of a higher purpose. He sees popes and cardinals among the hoarders, recognizable only by their tonsured heads, and he realizes that even the most sacred offices can be corrupted by the gravity of greed. The weights continue to crash together, a rhythmic reminder that when we live for things rather than meanings, we turn our own lives into a repetitive and soulless machine. As they move deeper, the ground turns to a swamp of dark and boiling water known as the River Styx, which serves as the boundary for the 5th circle and the first true defense of lower hell. Here, Dante sees the wrathful, naked and covered in mud, tearing at each other with their teeth and their hands in a frenzy of eternal rage that never finds a resolution. But beneath them, submerged in the thickest part of the mire, are the sullen, those who were filled with a cold and quiet anger in life, and who now bubble in the mud, saying, "We were sad in the sweet air that is gladdened by the sun." This is a crucial psychological distinction between the external explosion of wrath and the internal rot of resentment. Dante realizes that both are forms of spiritual suicide, one that destroys others and one that slowly drowns the self. They are ferried across the swamp by Phligus, the demon of fury, and during the crossing Dante is approached by Filippo Argente, a man who in life had been a wealthy enemy of Dante in Florence. Argente reaches for the boat with muddy hands, and Dante does something unexpected. Instead of pity, he feels a sharp and righteous anger. He tells the soul to stay in its weeping and its sorrow, and Virgil embraces Dante for this reaction. This is a major turning point in Dante's education, because he is finally learning to align his emotions with the truth of justice. He is no longer the man who fainted for Francesca, He is a man who recognizes that evil must be rejected with the same intensity with which it was chosen. The horizon of hell shifts as they approach the city of Dis, a massive fortress with walls of glowing iron and towers that pulse with a red fire that comes from within. This is the beginning of lower hell, where sins are no longer of the flesh, but of the mind and the will. As they reach the gates, thousands of fallen angels descend from the battlements, shouting at Virgil to leave the living man behind and return to his own circle. For the first time in the journey, Virgil is genuinely afraid, and his reason fails him as he is blocked by the absolute stubbornness of evil that refuses to listen to logic. The Medusa appears on the towers, and Dante is forced to cover his eyes, because to look at the ultimate despair is to be turned to stone. This is a profound sensory and psychological moment that represents the limits of the human intellect. It tells us that there are crises in life that cannot be solved by thinking or by rhetoric, but require a direct intervention from the infinite. Just as the tension reaches a breaking point, a heavenly messenger descends over the dark waters of the Styx, walking with dry feet and opening the gates with a single touch of a small wand. The demons scatter like frogs before a snake, and Dante and Virgil enter the city of fire, realizing that while reason can map the darkness, only grace can open the door to the next level of the soul's investigation. Inside the walls of Dis, they find a vast landscape of open tombs filled with fire, where the heretics are punished, specifically those who followed the philosopher Epicurus and believed that the soul dies with the body. Dante walks among the glowing lids and is called out by Farinata degli Uberiti, a great Ghibelline, leader of Florence, who rises from his grave with such composure and pride that he seems to hold all of hell in great contempt. Their conversation is a masterpiece of political tension. Two enemies from the same city debating the history of their civil war across the boundary of death. But the dialogue is interrupted by Cavalcanti, di Cavalcanti, the father of Dante's best friend, who asks why his son is not with him and fears that he is dead. This scene creates a sharp contrast between the cold political pride of Farinata and the raw parental grief of Cavalcanti. Dante realizes that even in damnation, the human heart remains preoccupied with the people and the places it loved on earth. Farinata explains that the damned can see the distant future but are blind to the present, a psychological punishment that represents how those who rejected the eternal soul are now trapped in a fractured experience of time. Dante feels a profound weight as he looks at these great men who are stuck forever in their own limited perspectives, realizing that the greatest error of the intellect is to believe that the horizon of our own eyes is the limit of reality. Leaving the city of heretics, they descend a steep and shattered rock face that was broken during the earthquake. At the death of Christ, and they reach the seventh circle where the violent are punished. The landscape is dominated by the Phlegethon, a river of boiling blood where souls are submerged according to the amount of blood they shed in life. Tyrants are in up to their eyebrows, while common murderers are at their waists. The banks are patrolled by centaurs armed with bows and arrows, who shoot any soul that tries to rise higher than its assigned depth. Dante meets Nessus, the centaur who carries him across the river, and he observes the faces of famous conquerors and warmongers, realizing that violence is not a heroic act, but a descent into the bestial nature of the self. He sees the logic of the punishment, that those who lived by the blood of others must now exist within it for eternity. The heat of the blood is so intense, it creates a red fog that obscures the sun, and the sound of the boiling is a constant low roar that vibrates in Dante's bones. He is learning that every act of violence leaves a permanent mark on the architecture of the world, and that the energy we use to destroy others is the same energy that eventually creates the cage of our own future. Beyond the river of blood, they enter a forest that has no green leaves and no fruit, but only black and twisted branches filled with poison thorns, and the harpy's nest in the canopy tearing at the souls who have been turned into trees. This is the realm of the suicides, those who destroyed their own bodies and therefore are denied any human form in the afterlife. Dante hears the sound of weeping coming from every direction, but sees no one, and at Virgil's direction, he breaks a small branch from a great thorn bush. Immediately the tree bleeds dark blood and screams in a voice that sounds like wood splintering. "Why do you tear me?" The voice belongs to Pier della Vigna, who was once the most trusted advisor to Emperor Frederick, but who killed himself when he was falsely accused of treason. Pier speaks with a sophisticated and courtly rhetoric, even in his Barkoved state, proving that the mind survives the destruction of the body, but is now imprisoned by its own act of despair. Dante is so overwhelmed by the tragedy of this man that he cannot speak, and he realizes that the body is not a possession to be discarded, but a sacred instrument of the spirit. He watches as the souls of the profligates, who wasted their lives in chaos, run through the wood, chased by black hounds that tear them apart, adding more pain to the trees they crash against. He learns that self-destruction is the ultimate disorientation, and that to reject the light of life is to become a permanent part of the shadow. The third ring of the circle of violence is a vast plain of burning sand, where a rain of fire falls in slow, large flakes like snow in the mountains, and here the violent against God, nature, and art are punished. Dante sees the blasphemers lying face up, the usurers huddling in the heat, and the sodomites who must run endlessly under the fire. And it is here that he has one of the most emotional encounters of the journey, when he recognizes the scorched face of Brunetto Latini, his former teacher and mentor in Florence. Brunetto was the man who taught Dante how man makes himself. Eternal through his work, and seeing him in this place is a devastating psychological blow for the pilgrim. They walk together for a long time, Dante on the cool path and Brunetto on the burning sand, and their conversation is filled with mutual respect and a deep sadness for the corruption of their city. Brunetto provides a final prophecy of Dante's exile and tells him to follow his star to reach a glorious port. Dante realizes that even a great teacher and a brilliant mind can be carried away by the gravity of their own disordered nature, and that intellectual achievement does not excuse the violation of the natural order. He bows his head in reverence to the man who shaped his dimog, but he understands that the path of the soul is more demanding than the path of the scholar, and he leaves his master in the fire, moving toward the edge of a great waterfall where the sound of the abyss is waiting. The air at the edge of the seventh circle vibrates with a low and terrifying roar as the river of blood plunges over a massive precipice into the depths of the eighth. Dante and Virgil stand at the brink of this abyss, where the scale of the landscape shifts once again from the natural to the monstrous. Here Dante does something symbolic that many readers overlook. He removes a cord that was tied around his waist, a cord he once hoped to use to catch the leopard of his own lust, and he hands it to Virgil. Virgil throws the cord into the dark void, and in response a shape begins to rise from the depths. Swimming through the thick air like a diver returning to the surface, it is Geryon, the embodiment of fraud. With the face of a just and honest man, the body of a colorful serpent, and a poisonous scorpion's tail hidden beneath the surface, Dante realizes that fraud always presents an attractive face to the world while concealing a lethal sting. They climb onto the back of this beast, and as they descend through the dark, Ere Dante feels a vertigo that is not just physical, but existential. He is leaving the realm of violence where the sins were clear and entering the realm of the mind, where everything is distorted by the weaponization of the intellect. He looks at the walls of the pit as they glide down, and he understands that the descent into the deepest parts of the human shadow requires us to let go of our own simple defenses and trust the process of the journey. They land in Malbolge, which translates to evil ditches, a vast stone structure composed of 10 concentric trenches connected by bridges like the spokes of a wheel. This is the 8th circle where the sins of simple fraud are punished. Dante looks down into the first ditch and sees the panderers and seducers being whipped by horned demons, forced to run in opposite directions for eternity. He realizes that those who used the desires of others for their own profit are now subject to a force they cannot control. In the second ditch, he sees the flatterers submerged in human excrement, a visceral and disgusting punishment that represents the worthlessness of the words they used to manipulate the pride of others. Dante is learning that the higher the intellect, the more devastating its misuse becomes. The stone bridges under his feet are cold and slippery, and the atmosphere is thick with the smell of decay and the sound of frantic movement. He begins to see that fraud is not just a personal sin, but a social poison that dissolves the glue of trust that holds a civilization together. Every bridge he crosses reveals a new layer of how humans deceive one another, transforming the sacred gift of language into a tool for destruction. In the third ditch, Dante encounters those who sold spiritual offices and divine favors for money. The punishment here is a terrifying visual inversion. The souls are stuck headfirst in holes in the rock, with only their feet protruding, and their souls are licked by hungry flames. Dante realizes that because they inverted the proper order of things in life, putting the material above the spiritual, they are physically inverted for eternity. He speaks to Pope Nicholas III, who mistakes Dante for his successor Boniface VIII. And Dante delivers a scathing oration against the corruption of the papacy and the greed that has turned the church into a house of gold and blood. Virgil carries Dante down the steep bank to hear this confession, showing that the intellect must sometimes support the spirit when it speaks a hard truth to power. Dante realizes that when the keepers of the sacred become the merchants of the material, the entire world loses its orientation. He watches as the feet of the popes twitch in the fire, and he feels a deep and solemn anger, realizing that the higher the office, the more catastrophic the fall. Moving to the fourth ditch, Dante sees a procession of souls who are weeping in silence, and as they approach, he realizes with horror that their heads have been twisted completely backwards so that their tears fall down their backs. These are the sorcerers, the astrologers, and the false prophets who attempted to see too far into the future, and who are now denied even the ability to see what is directly in front of them. Dante is so overwhelmed by this distortion of the human form that he breaks down in tears, but Virgil rebukes him sharply, telling him that pity has no place here where divine justice is so clearly expressed. Dante realizes that the attempt to bypass the present and manipulate the future is a violation of the soul's true purpose, which is to live in the reality of the now. He sees Amphiaraus and Tiresias, and he understands that the hunger for secret knowledge and the desire to control the unknown is a path that leads to a permanent loss of direction. He learns that the backward gaze of these souls is the inevitable result of a life lived in the service of their own curiosity rather than the truth. The fifth ditch is filled with a thick and bubbling pitch where the barators, the corrupt politicians who sold public offices for bribes, are submerged, guarded by a troop of grotesque and comedic demons called the Malabronx. who use grappling hooks to pull back any soul that tries to surface. This scene is unique in the comedy for its dark humor and its frantic energy as the demons argue and trick each other, while Dante and Virgil hide behind a rock. Dante realizes that corruption in public life turns the seriousness of government into a chaotic and demonic game. The pitch represents the sticky and hidden nature of political bribes, and the fact that these souls are hidden beneath the surface mirrors the way their crimes were committed in the shadows of the Florentine Republic. Dante watches as a demon tosses a new soul into the tar, and he feels a personal connection to this place, because he himself was falsely accused of this very crime during his exile. He understands that the difference between the innocent man and the damned man is not the accusation, but the internal orientation of the heart. They escape the demons and enter the sixth ditch, where the hypocrites walk in a slow and heavy circle, wearing magnificent cloaks that are gilded with gold on the outside, but lined with heavy lead on the inside. The souls are exhausted by the immense weight of their own appearances, forced to move in a perpetual slog that represents the crushing burden of maintaining a false image. Dante meets the jovial friars of Florence, who were supposed to bring peace, but instead brought more fracture to the city, and he realizes that hypocrisy is the art of making the soul's rot look like holiness. Across the path, he sees Caiaphas, the high priest, who argued for the crucifixion of Christ, now crucified to the ground and trampled by the heavy, leaden cloaks of the others for eternity. Dante understands that the ultimate hypocrisy is the sacrifice of truth for the sake of political or institutional stability. He feels the weight of the air in this ditch, as if the very atmosphere is made of lead, and he realizes that the path to the light requires us to strip away the gilded cloaks of our own reputation and stand naked in the truth of what we are. As we cross into the ditches of Malbolge, the atmosphere shifts from the melancholy of the upper circles to a frantic, mechanical horror. Here, fraud is not an abstract concept. It is a physical disease. We see the flatterers submerged in human waste, their screams muffled by the stench of their own tongues. We see the simoniacs, the corrupt leaders of the church, stuck headfirst in the rock like discarded instruments, their feet twitching in the hungry flames. Dante's anger here is no longer the fainting pity of the early circles. It is a cold and surgical rage. He is watching the social fabric of his world being dismantled by the weaponization of the intellect. Every bridge he crosses reveals a new layer of how we deceive one another. And as the demons of the pitch hiss and snarl at the edge of the bridges, we realize that the deepest ditches are not made of stone, but of the broken trust that holds a civilization together. They climb to the eighth ditch, where the air is filled with thousands of flickering lights, like fireflies in a summer valley, and each light is a tongue of fire containing the soul of a fraudulent counselor. Dante is fascinated by a flame that is split into two peaks, and Virgil tells him it contains Ulysses and Diomedes. Dante's fascination with Ulysses is profound because he sees in the Greek hero a mirror of his own intellectual ambition. Ulysses speaks from the heart of the flame, telling the story of his final voyage, how he could not even be held back by the love of his son or his wife because of his hunger to follow virtue and knowledge, and explore the world beyond the pillars of Hercules. It is a magnificent and seductive speech that celebrates the human spirit's refusal to accept boundaries, but Dante realizes the tragedy beneath the rhetoric. Ulysses persuaded his men to follow him into a voyage that led to their destruction because his knowledge was not anchored in any authority higher than his own curiosity. Dante learns that the intellect, when it is not oriented by love and justice, becomes a fire that eventually consumes its own master, and he watches as the ship of Ulysses is swallowed by the sea, realizing that his own poetic voyage must be guided by a different star if he is to survive the journey. Dante and Virgil descend into the seventh ditch, where the air is a suffocating tangle of serpents and screams. Here the thieves are punished in a way that represents the ultimate loss of the self. Dante watches in horror as a soul is bitten by a venomous snake and immediately bursts into flame, dissolving into ash only to be reconstituted a moment later in a cycle of endless agony. But the true psychological terror occurs when he witnesses a mutual transformation. A giant six-legged serpent wraps itself around a human soul, and their forms begin to melt and merge like hot wax. The human becomes a beast, and the beast becomes a human, until neither possesses a stable identity. Dante realizes that because these souls stole the property of others in life, they are denied the property of their own bodies in eternity. This is a profound meditation on the nature of integrity. Dante understands that when we take what does not belong to us, we fracture the boundaries of our own being, until we are no longer sure where we end and the world begins. He sees Vanni Fucci, who makes a defiant and obscene gesture toward the heavens, and Dante realizes that the most hardened thieves are those who try to steal the dignity of the divine itself. He leaves the ditch feeling a cold tremor in his soul, realizing that the intellect without honesty is a snake that eventually devours its own face. The ninth ditch is a landscape of butchery that tests Dante's ability to remain an observer. Here the sowers of discord, those who tore apart religions, nations, and families, are forced to walk in a circle where a demon with a sharp sword hacks them open as they pass. By the time they complete the loop, their wounds have healed, only to be reopened again and again. Dante meets Muhammad and Ali, reflecting the medieval view of theological fracture. But the most haunting figure is Bertrand de Born, who walks carrying his own severed head by the hair like a lantern. The head speaks to Dante, explaining that because he separated a father from a son in life, his own head is now separated from its source. This is the most literal and terrifying example of contrapasso, the law of the counterstroke, where the sin becomes the visible environment of the sinner. Dante realizes that social and political harmony is a fragile body that we all inhabit, and that every act of betrayal or division is a physical wound on the soul of the community. He sees the blood and the entrails spilling onto the stone, and he feels the heavy weight of his own political past, wondering if his own words in Florence ever served to divide what should have been unified. The final ditch of Malbolge is a massive infirmary of the damned, where the falsifiers of metals, persons, coins, and words are punished with a variety of horrific diseases. The air is thick with the smell of rotting flesh and the sound of scratching fingernails against scabs. Dante sees the alchemists covered in leprosy, scratching themselves with a fury that sounds like a knife scraping a pan. He meets Master Adam, a counterfeiter who is bloated with dropsy and tormented by an eternal thirst for the cool waters of the Cusson. Dante watches as two souls fall into a violent brawl, biting and tearing at each other in a fever of madness. He is so fascinated by the spectacle of their degradation that Virgil has to rebuke him once again, telling him that to listen to such things is a base desire. Dante realizes that fraud at this level is a disease of the entire human system, a corruption of the very elements of reality. He understands that when we lie about the nature of things, we turn the world into a hospital of illusions where no one can be cured because no one can be trusted. He moves toward the edge of the pit, his senses overwhelmed by the stench of falsehood, preparing for the final descent into the frozen silence of the bottom. As they leave the evil ditches, Dante sees what he first thinks are massive towers rising through the mist. But as he gets closer, he realizes they are giants, ancient beings like Nimrod and Ephi, buried up to their waists in the rock that forms the perimeter of the final circle. These giants represent the raw, unthinking power of the earth when it is disconnected from reason and grace. Nimrod babbles in an incomprehensible language, a reminder of the Tower of Babel and the loss of human unity. Dante realizes that these giants are the physical manifestations of the pride that built the walls of the primitive foundations of all evil. They are frozen in time, their massive limbs shackled by the very earth they tried to conquer. Antaius, the only giant who is not bound, reaches down and picks up Dante and Virgil, placing them gently on the floor of the final abyss. Dante feels the temperature drop until the air itself seems to crystallize in his lungs. He is standing on a lake of ice that looks like glass, and he realizes that he has reached the point where the universe has lost all its heat, the place where love is not just absent, but impossible. The ninth circle is the lake of Cocytus, frozen solid by the fanning of Lucifer's wings, and here the traitors are submerged in the ice in 4 distinct zones. In Cana, the traitors to kin have only their heads above the ice, their teeth chattering like stalks. In the traitors to country are buried deeper, and Dante accidentally kicks the head of Bocca degli Abati, a Florentine traitor. Dante's reaction is one of cold violence. He pulls at the soul's hair to force it to reveal its name, showing that he has finally aligned his will with the absolute rejection of the ultimate evil. He then encounters Count Ugolino, who is gnawing on the skull of Archbishop Ruggieri in a scene of cannibalistic horror. Ugolino tells the story of how he and his children were starved to death in a tower in Pisa, and Dante realizes that betrayal creates a world where humans become animals, eating one another in a cycle of perpetual hunger. He understands that the ice is not a punishment for hate, but for the coldness of the intellect that treats other human beings as objects for its own survival. The silence of the ice is more terrifying than all the screams of the upper circles, because it is the silence of a soul that has completely severed its connection to the rest of humanity. At the very center of the ice and the very center of the universe stands Dis, or Lucifer, a giant of such immense proportions that Dante feels smaller than a flea in his shadow. He has 3 faces, red, yellow, and black, representing a perversion of the Holy Trinity. And in each mouth he chews a soul. In the central mouth is Judas, the traitor to spiritual authority, and in the side mouths are Brutus and Cassius, the traitors to temporal authority. Lucifer is not a king in his castle, but a mindless engine of destruction, weeping from his 6 eyes and creating the very ice that binds him through the motion of his bat-like wings. Dante realizes that the origin of evil is not a rebellion of power, but a rebellion of weight, a falling away from the light into the stagnation of the self. He and Virgil begin the most physically and psychologically demanding part of the journey, climbing down the shaggy fur of the monster's haunches as they pass the center of the earth. Dante feels a sudden and disorienting shift. What was down is now up, and they begin to ascend through a narrow hollow in the rock. Following the sound of a hidden stream, Dante realizes that to escape the abyss, one must be willing to pass through the very center of the monster, turning the gravity of the fall into the energy of the climb. At the absolute center of the universe, there is no fire, There is only a silence, so cold it feels like a physical weight. We see Lucifer, the three-faced engine of stagnation, weeping from 6 eyes as his bat-like wings fan the very ice that binds him. He is not a king in rebellion. He is a monument to the absence of love, but it is here, at the lowest point of human gravity, that Dante and Virgil performed the ultimate psychological turn. As they climb down the shaggy fur of the monster, the world suddenly flips, down becomes up, and the weight of the past begins to fall away. This is the seed of all transformation, the realization that the only way to escape the abyss is to walk through the very center of the thing that terrifies us. They emerge from the narrow hollow of the rock to see the southern stars, and for the first time in 90 minutes, we let the viewer breathe. The sulfur is gone. The air is sweet with the smell of the sea, and the mountain of hope rises in the distance like a promise. After a long and silent ascent through the darkness of the earth's interior, following the course of the Lethe which carries the memory of sins back down to the center, Dante and Virgil emerge onto a narrow shore. The air is no longer sulphurous or frozen, but cool and sweet with the smell of the sea. Dante looks up and sees 4 stars that have not been seen by human eyes since the beginning of time. The constellations of the southern hemisphere representing the 4 cardinal virtues. The sky is a deep sapphire blue, and the light of the pre-dawn sun is beginning to touch the horizon. Dante feels the grime of hell being washed from his face by the dew, and he realizes that he has survived the absolute darkness. He is standing at the base of the mountain of purgatory, a landscape of hope that rises out of the ocean like a promise. Dante realizes that the journey through the Inferno was not a sentence, but a preparation, a clearing of the eyes so that he can finally see the world as it truly is. He feels the boge of his personal exile transforming into the dignity of the pilgrim. And as the sun begins to rise, he prepares to climb the mountain where the soul consents to its own healing. The odyssey of the Inferno ends here, on the shore of the southern sea. But the story of Dante Alighieri is only midway through its transformation. He has mapped the geometry of human failure and witnessed the absolute limits of the soul's refusal to love. He has seen that hell is a state of being where the ego becomes its own eternal cage. But now he stands before a mountain that represents the possibility of change. He realizes that while hell is fixed and static, the rest of the universe is in motion, always moving toward the light. He looks at the mountain rising into the clouds, and he understands that the climb will be hard, but that every step upward is a step toward the recovery of the child he once was. He has left behind the screams of the ditches and the silence of the ice, and he is ready to enter the realm of cooperation where the soul works with grace to rebuild its own architecture. Dante realizes that he is no longer just a citizen of Florence or an exile in Verona, but a citizen of the stars, and as he and Virgil walk toward the mountain, the Odyssey prepares to shift its tone from the tragedy of the pit to the comedy of the ascent. The path is clear, the way is open, and the stars are waiting. As the light of the final vision fades, we realize that the Odyssey of Dante was never about a journey through the center of the earth, but a journey to the center of the self. He has shown us that the dark wood is not an end, but a beginning, and that the loss of everything on earth is sometimes the only way to gain a perspective on the infinite. If Dante's exile has made you reflect on your own dark wood, or the orientation of your own heart, then our mission at Historicon is complete. Dante left the world with thousands of pages of questions more powerful than most men's answers, proving that curiosity is a form of courage, and that the soul that dares to look into its own darkness is the only one capable of moving the stars. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Please like this video to help these deep dives reach more curious minds, and share your thoughts in the comments about which circle of the journey resonated with your own experience. If you are ready for your next intellectual odyssey, click on the video appearing on your screen now, covering the life of another Titan who lived ahead of his time. Remember that as long as we keep asking why, the spirit of discovery never dies. See you in the next chapter of history.